I thought the worst part was discovering my wife's betrayal, but then the DNA test came back. In that moment, my entire world collapsed and I realized, some betrayals cut deeper than love ever could. My name is Chris Montgomery and I'm 48 years old, the fourth child of William, a corporate attorney, and Linda, a dedicated nurse. My family had always been firmly rooted in tradition, and that foundation nearly crumbled the day I broke the news that I had no interest in going to college. It was the end of my junior year in high school, and my parents, who were rarely at a loss for words, sat in stunned silence before launching a campaign to make my life miserable. Higher education wasn't just encouraged in the Montgomery household, it was expected. So much so that my parents took matters into their own hands, secretly submitting applications to 6 prestigious colleges and universities on my behalf. To their delight and my dismay, I was accepted into all of them, which only intensified the pressure to conform. The entire family saw it as a given that I would attend, everyone except my grandfather, Henry Montgomery. For as long as I could remember, I had spent my school vacations working alongside Grandpa Henry. Long before the term house flipping became popular, he was buying rundown homes, restoring them to their former glory, and selling them for a significant profit. During the spring semester of my junior year, with his guidance, I purchased my first 2 fixer-uppers. That summer, instead of clocking in at a minimum wage job like most of my friends, I was overseeing contractors, electricians, plumbers, and painters, ensuring every detail of the renovations was done right. Just before Labor Day, as summer was winding down, I sold the second house. When all was said and done, I split the profits with Grandpa Henry and walked away with nearly $88,000 in my pocket. The following summer, I took things a step further. This time, Grandpa Henry insisted I secure my own financing, though he agreed to co-sign my loans. By the time the season ended, I had successfully flipped 3 more houses. After giving my grandfather his well-earned 25% share, I still had more money than most 17-year-olds could dream of. I wasn't against learning, I was actually a strong student, but I knew deep down that college wasn't my path. Eventually, my parents and I reached a compromise. They agreed to let me take a gap year after high school, with the condition that I reapply to college the following year and make a decision as a family. While my friends spent the summer juggling part-time jobs and preparing for their freshman year, I was building my own future. I bought a used Ford F-150 with 123,000 miles on it, picked up a basic cell phone, and launched Montgomery Construction. Determined to expand my business, I reached out to every real estate agent who would give me the time of day, explaining exactly the kind of properties I was looking for. I promised to use them as my buying agent whenever I purchased a home they recommended and as my selling agent once renovations were complete. That's how I met the Kelly sisters, Jan and Mickey. In their mid-20s and relatively new to the real estate world, they had recently launched their careers after finishing college. They were part of a well-known national real estate firm, and something about their drive and hustle immediately caught my attention. Little did I know this partnership would play a pivotal role in the next stage of my journey. At the time, I was juggling the renovation of 2 properties when my phone rang. "Hey Chris, it's Mickey Sullivan," came the familiar voice on the other end. "I think I found a house in West Hartford that fits what you're looking for. Want to check it out?" If there was one thing Grandpa Henry had drilled into me, it was the importance of urgency. When an opportunity knocked, you didn't waste time, you acted. "Absolutely," I replied without hesitation. "I can meet you in 90 minutes. The house was a modest ranch, likely built about half a century earlier. As Mickey led me through the property, she explained that it had belonged to an elderly couple who had lived there for nearly 35 years. Now their children, settled on the West Coast, were eager to sell quickly and finalize the estate. Structurally, the house was in great shape, but it was long overdue for a serious update. "What do you think they'd take for it?" I asked, already running numbers in my head. Mickey didn't hesitate. "It'll probably move fast. We might have to come close to the $89,000 asking price." I suspected she was right, but I also knew how to play the game. "Let's offer $85,500, cash. I want 5 days for due diligence and to close within 5 days of the inspection report, assuming there aren't any major surprises." Mickey lit up at my confidence. We drove back to her office where she drafted the offer. Within hours, it was signed and sent to the listing agent. A day later, my offer was accepted. When the inspector's report came back clean, we wasted no time closing the deal. 1 week later, as we stepped out of the attorney's office with the paperwork finalized, Mickey turned to me with a grin. "We should celebrate," she said. "My apartment's just a couple of miles from here. Come have a drink." I followed her to a stylish 3rd-floor apartment on the edge of downtown West Hartford. As we walked inside, she handed me a bottle of Merlot and gestured toward the kitchen. "You can do the honors," she said with a playful smile. I uncorked the bottle, poured 2 glasses, and we silently toasted to the deal before taking our first sips. "I hope you don't mind if we celebrate in other ways," Mickey said, her eyes holding mine a little longer than before. "Grandpa Henry had taught me a lot, but some things you just had to learn on your own." Meanwhile, my business was growing at a steady pace. I was flipping anywhere from a dozen to 15 houses a year while also expanding into rental properties. My latest focus was on acquiring 6 to 12 unit apartment buildings, fixing up individual units as tenants moved out, and holding on to them for steady rental income. It seemed like a great way to diversify, until I learned the hard way that managing rental properties came with its own set of headaches. Let's just say that being woken up at 3 a.m. to deal with a broken toilet wasn't exactly my idea of success. Realizing that managing rental properties wasn't my strong suit, especially when it came to late-night maintenance emergencies, I decided to hire a real estate management company to handle the day-to-day issues. It was one of the best business decisions I ever made, freeing up my time to focus on expanding my investments rather than fixing leaky faucets at 3 a.m. Meanwhile, life moved on for those around me. Within 2 months of each other, both Mickey and Jen got married. Although I had never been romantically involved with either of them, their younger sister, Kate, and I had developed a friendship over time. One day, Kate made something very clear to me. "If we ever date, even exclusively, you have to promise me one thing," she said. "Name it," I replied, curious. "You can't date my sisters." "Deal?" she said with a smirk. I laughed and agreed. "That's an easy one." But Kate wasn't finished. "And there's something else you should know," she added, her expression turning serious. "I'm not someone who casually dates. I've never been one to jump from one person to another. If I'm with someone, I'm with them completely." I respected that about her, and after asking her out multiple times, she finally said yes. Our first real date was at my place, and I wanted to make it special. I picked her up from her parents' house, and when we arrived at my home, I gave her a grand tour. She seemed pleasantly surprised, but what really caught her off guard was the dinner I had prepared: homemade lasagna, asparagus, and a fresh salad. We ate outside on the patio, sipping wine and talking for hours. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and before we knew it, the candles on the table had burned down to their wicks. At one point, I set my glass down and looked at her. "Can I ask you something?" Kate nodded, tucking her hair behind her ear. "Of course. I've really enjoyed getting to know you, and I want to spend more time together," I said. "I don't have any interest in seeing anyone else. Would you consider being exclusive?" For a brief moment, Kate's smile faded and my heart sank, thinking I had misread things. But then she took a deep breath and gave me an answer that would change everything. Fast forward a couple of years and Kate and I were preparing to get married. As we finalized our wedding plans, we also discussed our financial future. Since I had built my company from the ground up, I wanted to make sure everything was handled fairly, especially if we had children someday. Together, we worked out an agreement. All assets from my business would remain separate, and any child support obligations would be set by the court if needed. Additionally, we each agreed to contribute $5,000 per year into a college fund for future children. It was simple, straightforward, and fair. "I don't see any issues with it," I told my attorney, George. "But I'll have you review it just in case. I'll get back to you within the week." Kate and I tied the knot at the end of her second year of teaching, and to celebrate, we took a 2-week honeymoon island hopping through the Caribbean. It was the perfect way to start our life together. One of the most unexpected yet rewarding changes in my life after getting married was how my work-life balance shifted. My days of grinding through 60-hour work weeks, traveling from one renovation project to the next, were over. Instead, my new responsibilities required just 20 to 30 hours per week, allowing me to focus on bigger picture strategies rather than daily operations. For the first time in my career, I wasn't just building houses, I was building a life. With my work schedule more manageable, I was able to dedicate more of my time to my family. My daily routine was simple but structured: up at 4 a.m. for an hour-long workout, then back home to start the day. Despite our busy lives, Kate and I always made time for each other, both emotionally and physically. Even after 12 years of marriage, we were still intimate 3 or 4 times a week, keeping our connection strong. However, the biggest challenge in our relationship had surfaced years earlier, during our 3rd year of marriage. It was Valentine's Day, and we were celebrating at our favorite local restaurant. The evening had been perfect: good food, great conversation, and plenty of laughter. We had just started dessert when Kate set her fork down and looked at me seriously. "I'd like to ask you something," she said. I smiled, leaning in. Go ahead. She hesitated for a moment before continuing. Would you be okay with me going on a trip with my sisters? My stomach tightened. Without missing a beat, I shook my head. That's an easy no. I'm not okay with it, and honestly, I'm amazed that you even have to ask. Kate's expression shifted from hopeful to irritated. What's the problem with me going away with my sisters? She asked, her tone edged with frustration. I was stunned. Shaking my head, I exhaled and replied, Kate, you know exactly what the problem is. Mickey and Jan have always been reckless. They were trouble 5 years ago when we started dating, and they're still the same now, especially after both of their marriages ended because of cheating. Let's be honest here, your sisters are like magnets for bad decisions and you know it. Kate's face flushed with anger as I tossed my napkin onto the table, stood up, and headed for my jacket. I walked outside, started the car, and glanced at the clock. I decided I'd give her exactly 3 minutes to pay the tab and meet me in the parking lot. She made it with 7 seconds to spare, storming toward the car and slamming the door as she got in. Don't you ever embarrass me like that again. Do you understand me? She snapped. I stayed silent for half a mile before speaking calmly. We just had a conversation where I was informed that I can't tell you what to do. So tell me, how is it fair that I'm not allowed to have an opinion on this? Kate crossed her arms. Chris, do you really think I'd cheat on you just because I'm going on a cruise? I sighed, keeping my voice steady. Sitting here right now? No, I don't think you're planning to cheat on me. But in a few days you'll be on a ship with your sisters, drinking, partying, and surrounded by men. 3 gorgeous women in that kind of environment? That attracts attention, and that kind of attention can lead to bad decisions, especially when 2 of those women have a history of making them. Kate opened her mouth to argue, but I could tell my words had caught her off guard. She was already forming a response when I pulled over to the curb and turned to face her. I wasn't expecting Kate to cry. But as tears welled up in her eyes, she abruptly stood, turned toward the door, and walked away. Before disappearing down the hall, she shot back over her shoulder, I'm not planning on doing anything wrong. Her words lingered in the air long after she left, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. The morning of her departure, we sat around the kitchen table, finishing up what was left of our waffle breakfast. The remnants of syrup-sticky plates and half-drunk coffee cups were the only evidence of the meal. Kate was chatting with our daughters about their plans for the week, stealing glances at the clock every now and then. When the hands struck 8 a.m., she looked at me and without a word, stepped out of the kitchen. From the other room, I overheard Jan's voice. What's so important? She asked. Let's talk in the kitchen, Kate replied, shushing her sister. I don't want to take the chance that Chris will hear us. That sentence was all I needed to hear. Whatever they were discussing, she didn't want me involved. I abandoned my conference call without hesitation, disconnecting the line and immediately opening the home security app on my phone. I navigated to the live feed of our kitchen camera just as Kate walked back inside with her sisters. Mickey and Jan took their seats at the table while Kate poured herself a cup of coffee. That moment, watching them, knowing they were keeping something from me, solidified what I already knew deep down. From that point on, I started making arrangements. I met with my attorney and made it clear that my #1 priority was securing custody of my daughters. Fortunately, my lawyer assured me that wouldn't be a problem. I instructed him to file divorce papers citing irreconcilable differences but also to draft a second set listing infidelity, just in case. Financially, there was little to argue about. Early in our marriage, on the advice of my attorney, Kate and I had agreed to keep separate bank accounts. We each contributed equally to household expenses on a quarterly basis, but whatever remained was individually managed. When the time came to break the news, I knew I had to address it head-on. I think it's time for a family meeting, I said one evening, setting my glass down on the table. Looking at Mickey and Jan, I added, this will affect all of us. You're welcome to stay if you'd like. They nodded, and I got up to refill their wine glasses, topping off my own bourbon while I was at it. As I handed out the drinks, I turned to Kate. Would you like some wine? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She smiled softly and shook her head. No, thank you. Jan let out a laugh. Wow, Mom doesn't want a glass of wine on a Friday afternoon? What's the occasion? I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of what was coming next. In just a few days I'll be filing for divorce, I said, my voice steady. And once that happens, what's been private between us will become very public. Then, shifting my gaze to my daughters, I softened my tone. The next year is going to be difficult for our family, I told them. But no matter what happens, we're going to get through it together. I want to be honest with you from the start, I said, looking each of my daughters in the eye. I want to treat you with respect and tell you the truth. None of this is my fault. Your mother is the one who caused this mess. She made the choice to betray us. She threw away her marriage and tore this family apart. As I spoke, I watched their reactions carefully. Tears welled up in their eyes, which didn't surprise me. They had just been thrown into an emotional storm they never asked for. You don't have to be sorry, I reassured them. You were never supposed to be put in this position, to hear about things no child should have to. That's on your mother and your aunts. Not you. Kay was the first to speak, her voice small but firm. I don't want to live with Mom after the divorce. I want to stay with you. I hadn't expected her to have thought that far ahead, but hearing those words filled me with both pride and relief. I glanced at Carla and Kara, and to my surprise, they both nodded in agreement. Just as I was processing this, Kate decided to open her mouth and dig herself deeper. The mother always gets custody in a divorce, she snapped. If your father doesn't stop this nonsense immediately, he's only going to make things harder for all of you. Her words didn't shake me, but I could see my daughters stiffen. Before I could respond, Mickey and Jan shared an uneasy glance, clearly uncomfortable with where this was going. I turned to them. Well, it looks like you got what you wanted, I said, my voice calm but pointed. Mickey hesitated. What do you mean? She asked, already dreading my answer. I wanted a faithful, loving wife, I said, meeting her gaze. And you wanted Kate to be something else. Congratulations, you won. Mickey groaned. Chris, I'm not. I let out a sharp laugh. Please. Your actions speak for themselves. Jan jumped in, trying to shift the conversation. Let's be adults about this, she said. There's no need for insults. I shook my head, unwilling to entertain their excuses. Kate, in her usual fashion, tried every desperate move she could to stall the divorce. She didn't even go through official channels, probably because she didn't want the world to know what she had done. But in the end it didn't matter. The mandatory court-ordered counseling lasted exactly one session. It didn't take long for the counselor to see the truth. I had no interest in saving my marriage, and I wasn't about to let Kate manipulate the situation any further. The court upheld our prenuptial agreement. Kate kept the assets tied to her job and I kept my businesses. But the best part? I was awarded primary custody of Kay, Kara, and Carla. My two oldest daughters stood by my side, unwavering in their decision. They had seen enough. As I sat in my car at a red light, my mind wandered. The dust on the dashboard had settled, a quiet reminder of the passage of time. I tapped my fingers against the steering wheel, waiting for the light to change, when something odd caught my attention. Beneath the windshield, tiny crushed beetles left behind their remains, small but undeniable proof of past journeys. I reached for an old CD case on the passenger seat, but as I grabbed it, its rough edge scraped my wrist, snapping me out of my thoughts. For a brief second I felt disoriented. The world around me blurred, my mind clouded by something I had never truly considered before. A single question echoed in my head, shaking me to my core. Is it mine? The thought gripped me in a mix of shock and disbelief. Had I ever questioned it before? Had I ignored the signs? For the first time I realized, maybe I hadn't asked the questions I should have. I clung to the hope that my assumptions were wrong, that there was some other explanation, some misunderstanding that would ease my mind. But as I stared at the unmistakable evidence in front of me, any chance of that disappeared. The presence of the contraceptive confirmed my worst fears. There was no denying it anymore. Kate had been having an affair. And not just a fleeting mistake or a lapse in judgment, it had been going on for 4 months. That realization shattered any hope that this was an isolated incident. The evidence pointed to something deliberate, something with serious intent. As much as I wanted to believe there was no deeper meaning behind it, I couldn't ignore the possibility that she had done this out of resentment, maybe even revenge. The scenarios that ran through my mind were endless, and I had no way of predicting what she might say if confronted. I was at a complete loss. I had read enough about infidelity to know that sometimes a person cheats not because they're unhappy in their relationship, but because of something unresolved within themselves. But did that mean I was to blame in some way? Had I missed something? Despite the emotional wreckage, my sense of self remained intact. This wasn't the end of my life. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. Resentment, anger, sadness, confusion, all of it churned inside me, making it impossible to think straight. In those dark moments, I decided I needed answers. At exactly 1:30 p.m. I walked into the hotel lobby, my pulse steady but my mind racing. Approaching the front desk, I spotted the manager and calmly asked, I believe my wife may be having an affair. I need to find out who she's meeting here. His reaction was subtle, but I caught the way his expression shifted, just slightly skeptical. All I want to do is see the surveillance footage, I added, trying to keep my voice even. The doubt on his face deepened. I'm afraid I can't grant you access, sir, he replied, his tone polite but firm. With all due respect, the hotel is responsible for the safety and privacy of its guests. We can't allow personal investigations. I knew it was a long shot, but hearing the refusal still stung. There was a possibility that I would never get the full picture, that some details would remain forever unknown. During our conversation, he seemed to soften a little, eventually sharing bits of his personal life, stories about his family, his nephew's trouble with the law, and his father's declining health. We talked as he absent-mindedly picked at his lunch, and somehow the topic drifted to food. Calories, diets, portion control, he mused, shaking his head. I even tried the Atkins diet once. For a brief moment I almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. Here I was, in the middle of what felt like the biggest crisis of my life, discussing diet plans with a hotel manager who had no idea just how much my world had crumbled. And yet, maybe that was the strangest part of all. Life just kept moving forward whether I was ready or not. As our conversation continued, the hotel manager and I found ourselves agreeing on one thing. Sticking to a diet was one thing, but maintaining the results was the real challenge. It was strange how quickly we had fallen into an easy rhythm, almost like old acquaintances rather than two strangers in the middle of an unusual conversation. But the truth was, I wasn't really there to talk about calories or diet plans. My mind was fixated on something much heavier. Maybe you were deceived by an illusion, he mused at one point. Perhaps the version of her that you loved, the one who spoke sweetly and made you feel safe, was never real at all. His words hit harder than I expected. Was that what had happened? Had I fallen for a carefully crafted lie, while all along she had been planning my downfall? The situation wasn't black and white. It didn't fit neatly into categories of best or worst. It existed somewhere in the murky middle, where betrayal wasn't just singular, it was layered. Because this wasn't just about my wife's betrayal. There was someone else involved. If it had been a complete stranger, some random fling, or even an acquaintance like one of her friend's husbands, maybe it wouldn't have mattered as much. But something inside me told me it was deeper than that. Someone had betrayed me in more ways than one. Later that evening, as I arrived home around 6 p.m., I immediately noticed that Sherry was already in the shower. Her gym bag lay open on the floor as if beckoning me to take a look inside. I hesitated. Then, unable to fight my curiosity, I carefully sifted through it, hoping to find something, anything, that would confirm my suspicions. But there was nothing. No hidden messages. No incriminating evidence. Just an ordinary gym bag belonging to a woman who had, at least for now, covered her tracks. Hey, I'm going to hop in the shower too, I called out, my voice deliberately casual. I wasn't sure why I said it. Maybe to gauge her reaction. Maybe because I knew, deep down, that this might be the last time things felt remotely normal before everything came crashing down. Uncertainty loomed over me. How was I supposed to respond to this betrayal? The choices ran through my mind like a never-ending loop. Confront her in a fury or walk away with quiet dignity. Would this end in chaos or in an amicable divorce? I didn't know yet. And it wasn't just me struggling with the weight of the situation. When I finally confided in my close friends, the room fell silent. The weight of my words hung between us, pressing down like an invisible force. Tom, one of my oldest friends, sat there, his expression shifting as the reality of his own involvement in this tangled mess began to sink in. Peg, his wife, understood it immediately. Tom opened his mouth to explain, but before he could get a full sentence out, Peg turned and delivered a sharp, unexpected punch straight to his face. Time seemed to slow down as the moment stretched out, heavy with significance. No one moved. No one spoke. We all just sat there letting the moment sink in. Later that evening as I drove Sherry home, she gazed out the window in silence. Only when the car slowed to a stop did she realize where we were. Her parents' house. She let out a quiet, almost defeated groan. "No," she whispered. "Please no." I turned to her, expression unreadable. "Get out." She hesitated, then with a heavy sigh reached for the door handle. This was it. The end of everything we had built. And for the first time in a long time I finally felt in control. I tapped the steering wheel impatiently, my frustration mounting. Disappointment gripped me, a heat rising in my chest until I finally snapped. "Get out," I shouted, refusing to even glance in her direction. Sherry hesitated, then slowly reached for the door handle. Without another word she stepped out. I didn't wait to see her reaction. I just drove away. When I got home, my first instinct was to pour myself a strong drink, sink into the couch, and let mindless television numb my thoughts until exhaustion finally took over. But something inside me shifted. Instead, I found myself walking into our bedroom, her side of the closet standing there, untouched, as if nothing had changed. A storm of emotions churned inside me, but I wasn't sure if it was anger, sadness, or something else entirely. I closed the door and stepped into the shower, letting the hot water cascade over me. As I stood there, memories from the night before flashed through my mind, moments of intimacy that now felt like a cruel joke. It was surreal how quickly everything had changed, how the life I had known just days ago was now irreversibly shattered. And yet, strangely, I didn't feel overwhelmed by it. The weight of it all was there, but it didn't crush me. Not anymore. I decided I needed to have a direct conversation with Tom. There was no point in avoiding it any longer. I dialed his number, half expecting him to ignore my call. To my surprise, he picked up almost immediately. "Chris, I'm so sorry," he said before I could even speak. His voice was raw, filled with regret. "I swear it started as harmless flirting. I never thought it would go this far." His words rang hollow. We both knew that wasn't how this worked. As I listened to him scramble for an explanation, my thoughts drifted elsewhere, to my father. To something he had once said long before any of this had happened. "You should know," my father had told me once, shaking his head in disbelief, "how foolish she is. It's unbelievable." I had never heard him speak that way before. Not about her. "I can't believe I'm saying this about my own daughter," he continued, his voice quiet but firm. But this was foolish. He wasn't making excuses for her, but he also wasn't condemning her outright. He saw her actions for what they were, a catastrophic mistake. A mistake that, in his mind, could be overcome with effort and time. But I knew better. Sherry had made her choice. And so had I. Later that night, when I finally sat down across from her, I looked into her eyes, searching for something, remorse, understanding, maybe even the faintest trace of the love we once shared. "I want you to understand something," I said, my voice steady. "I once loved you, truly. And now, I'm giving you the opportunity to make me fall in love with you again." Sherry's breath hitched. She parted her lips as if to speak, but no words came out. "But know this," I continued. "I'm not going back. This marriage? It's history." Her expression twisted with emotion, lips pressing into a thin line as she absorbed the weight of my words. "If you truly love me," I added, leaning back, "then you'll do whatever it takes to win me back." Sherry nodded slowly, but the sadness in her eyes told me she already knew the truth. Some things, once broken, could never be put back together. I asked if she wanted to continue the conversation, suggesting we meet in person. "When are you available?" I asked. There was a brief pause before she replied, "What are you doing this afternoon? Would you like to grab a drink?" I suggested. She agreed, and when I arrived at the designated spot, I saw her waiting in a booth, a glass of water already in front of her. I slid into the seat across from her, our eyes meeting for a brief moment before I nodded in greeting. No need for small talk. No point in pretending. "Shall we discuss this?" I asked, getting straight to the point. But before that conversation could truly take shape, my phone buzzed with an alert. The test results were ready. Without hesitation, I excused myself, jumped into my car, and drove straight to the clinic. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my pulse quickening with every mile. I had convinced myself I was ready for the truth, whatever it was. But nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered. I was not the father of the unborn child. The weight of those words hit me like a wrecking ball. I sat there in my car for nearly an hour, staring at the result in stunned silence. Sorrow consumed me, and before I even realized it, tears had begun to fall. There was no more uncertainty. No more questioning. No more grasping at the idea that somehow, some way this could be salvaged. It was over. Sherry and I could never be together again. I conveyed the news to her the simplest way I could, through a text message. No drawn-out conversation. No room for manipulation. Along with the message, I attached a photo of the DNA test results. Cold. Unarguable. Final. Almost immediately, my phone started ringing. Call after call from Sherry. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say.